Welcome back, everybody, to part two of the Atlantic World Lecture. We're going to focus now in the second half of this lecture on the connection between Europeans and Africans in the settlement of New World societies. Both play a critical part in the repeopling of the Americas, and so we're going to focus now on the African connection. One thing that Europeans found out very quickly as they began to have contact with the peoples of West Africa is that despite their crusading mentality, conquest simply would not work where the peoples of West Africa were concerned. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, most of the societies of West Africa, at least the principal societies of West Africa, had a long history of connection across the Sahara Desert to the societies of Northern Africa and the Mediterranean coast, as well as Arabia, and through Arab traders beyond. What historians call a trans-Saharan trade route connected West African people with these far-flung global trade route connections, which over time had served to fortify and strengthen the societies of West Africa, and had made West African states simply too wealthy and powerful for the sort of conquest that the Portuguese and the Spanish and others may have had in mind. And in order to appreciate this, we have to wrap our minds around the true history of West Africa and get past many of the stereotypes and mythologies associated with Africa generally in the Western mind. The sort of Tarzan mythology, we might call it, from the popular culture of the West. Because far from being primitive, West Africans had a deep history, and a deep history in all the ways that made the great civilizations of the world so enduring and so strong in their own right. For example, with agriculture, a deep history of agriculture. West African peoples had been tending cattle and raising herds, not to mention growing food crops, not just for centuries prior to European arrival, but for millennia. Among some of the earliest agricultural production anywhere in the world was found in West Africa. And so it's not surprising that the peoples of West Africa had long grown used to eating well, growing healthy and strong on the diet that their agriculture afforded them. Famous for their one-pot stews, for example. Their flame cooking of beef seasoned with spices and peppers. Wonderful fruits like the banana. In fact, a banana is a Bantu word that comes directly from West Africa. The peoples of West Africa represented a cultural heartland of diverse languages and dialects, and were some of the most skilled and versatile speakers of language anywhere in the world. You can see from that slide just some of the subfamilies of spoken languages in West Africa. It was very common to grow up in West Africa speaking several dialects in daily intercourse. For these and other reasons, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and those who followed from Europe opt not for conquest, but for trade with the peoples of West Africa. It simply made more sense to establish trading connections, mostly along the West African coastline. Here you see the Portuguese trading fort. The Portuguese called it São Jorge da Mina, which translated in English, St. George, which of course illustrates the Catholic posture of the Portuguese, but St. George of the Mine. And that is because this particular part of the West African coast, known even today as the Gold Coast, yielded some of the great mineral wealth of West Africa that had been used by West African societies to fortify their wealth and trade options, and something that the Portuguese were also quite interested in buying their way into. The fact that they created virtual castles like the trading fortress here at São Jorge da Mina suggests that they were none too confident of their precarious position and really stayed there at the pleasure of the West African peoples, the tribal societies that governed the areas of West Africa that were so instrumental now to this burgeoning trade. We know that from this trade came one of the greatest human migrations in history, also one of the great tragic chapters, we might say, in human history, and that, of course, is what we know as the slave trade, more particularly the Atlantic slave trade, which will emanate now from the West African coastal states in partnership with the Europeans, and particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish, later on the Dutch, the French, and the English over time. And I say partnership, and I mean it, because if we have a notion that somehow Europeans descended on West Africa and simply strong-armed their way into taking slaves, kidnapping wholesale people, and selling them into to the Atlantic slave trade, then that's incorrect. There was no option as far as that went. As I said earlier, the European states were simply too weak, too unfamiliar, and not sufficiently well suited to the climates of interior West Africa to do that. So they had to go into business. And this, of course, raises the question, as it should, is that to say, therefore, that West Africans became partners in the selling of their own people into slavery? And the qualified answer is yes, but keep in mind that I think some of the confusion arises from our rather myopic view of Africa generally. We tend to assume in the West that an African is an African is an African. But recall that the peoples of Africa are extraordinarily diverse, linguistically, culturally, ethnically, and in virtually every way. Equally diverse, certainly as the peoples of Europe, probably more so in most respects. And so maybe the better analogy is to think of the European states and their fractious history of warfare and conquest. In the 20th century alone, there are 2 world wars that are essentially created by European states and fought against one another with casualties not just in the hundreds of thousands but in the millions. And from an outside view, one might ask, well, gee, in other words, Europeans slaughtered their fellow Europeans in the millions in the 20th century, and the correct answer, the qualified answer, is yes, but you would then go on to explain these were French and English and Russian and Austrian, etc., that these were different peoples of Europe who spoke different languages, that cultural traditions, physical boundaries, political boundaries, with great rivalries. And so, you get a similar situation in West Africa, with the peoples of West Africa being very diverse, foster rivalries, competitions for power, for trade, and ultimately that included a slave trade, just as it had in Europe during the Middle Ages. So slavery, not unique to the peoples of West Africa, certainly, but something that now will be exploited, the opportunity for slave trading that will be exploited by the Portuguese and the Spanish and others. And you can see here from this pie chart the relative percentages of people who were bartered into the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and where they, specifically where they came from in the states of West Africa. So from basically the Senegal River being here, the northern point of what we might call the slave coast, that is a coast upon which Europeans will trade with African people for many goods, but including captives, that is unfree or enslaved people, all the way down here to Angola, representing sort of the southern extent of that trade, but also including a smaller stream from the Portuguese base here in the Indian Ocean, from what is the island of Madagascar and Mozambique. So what we call the Atlantic slave trade, which will exist for the better part of 4 centuries, from the 1500s through to the mid to late 1800s, we'll see peoples of Africa, various peoples of Africa, by one means or another, bartered into, stolen into, forced into, purchased into what we call the Atlantic slave trade. And over time, nearly 12 million of these African people, men and women, over the course of 4 centuries, from the 1500s to the 1800s, will find their way, those that survive the tortuous Middle Passage aboard the slave ships. The Middle Passage was this route from West Africa to the Western Hemisphere. And those who survive, and they represent a majority of those taken, and the mortality rates changed over time from upwards of 30% to only 5% of those. That is to say, aboard any given slave ship, anywhere from 30% to 5% could perish in transit to the Western Hemisphere because of the terrible, crowded, unsanitary conditions. But keep in mind too that the European slave traders responsible for the Middle Passage had every incentive financially to keep every single enslaved person alive, if only to recoup the financial investment. So mortality certainly figures into this story, but it is clear, I think, from the historical record that the vast majority do survive that transit over time, and thus begin to add significantly, as we'll see here, to the population of the Americas. And keep in mind what we said in the lecture on pre-Columbian America about, and then earlier in this lecture on the Atlantic world, about the devastating effects of European contact with Native American people. So what we have is a simultaneous process of depopulation in the Americas, that is, the loss of native population due to the spread of disease, global diseases through the European contact, diseases that had never had, in effect, a market in the Americas due to the isolation and separation until the contact, the permanent contact from the age of Columbus forward. So the depopulation of Native American peoples, in some sense augmented by or supplemented by the added population now of African peoples. That's why we can call this process the repeopling of the Americas, and it's really almost unique on this large scale in human history, certainly tragic on both sides when you consider the dramatic loss of native population combined with the arrival of an enslaved African population. This forms the essential foundation now for the New World societies which Europeans create. Back to the story of Africans, a forced migration fed by the rise of one single cash crop that is preeminent among all others, and that was sugar. That is the rise of sugar production, sugar plantations, Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and Dutch throughout the Americas will be the driving engine of the slave trade. Sugar, as we said before, is a labor-intensive crop. It required strong and knowledgeable labor, skilled laborers. Unfortunately for many West Africans, their own success as agriculturalists will play against them now in the slave trade, as they are expected to essentially manage the rise of a cash crop economy that will change the global portrait. A reminder that all of this was bought and paid for with human suffering. The Middle Passage between Africa and the Western Hemisphere was fraught with the trials and ordeal of enslaved African people who essentially treated as commodities by the slave traders who worked for banks and investment houses in Europe. Treated as commodities, they were stacked like commodities, packed like human property, you might say, in the cargo holds of the slave trading vessels, often chained below decks to prevent escape. What escape, you would ask, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Well, as one captive said, the last friend, death, being the escape to jump overboard. Some slave traders took no chances. They put nets around the deck of the ship, so that even if you could manage in a sort of desperate suicidal effort to throw yourself overboard, the nets would catch you. So for the most part, chained underneath in the filth and stench and bad air of the below decks. This image you see here is one of the few actually drawn from life by a British naval officer, with watercolor paint. He captured a moment below the decks of a slave ship. Natural question arises: how could human beings justify this sort of traffic, this dehumanizing and cruel traffic of Africans? And it's a complicated answer that gets to the very contradiction of the human spirit, the human soul, the capacity for humanity, but also the capacity for inhumanity, particularly inhumanity that's augmented by not only material profit and material investment, but also a kind of cultural dehumanization. Consider, for example, how Europeans came to view African women. African women who were especially valuable in the slave trade over time because of their prospects as dual laborers. Not only could they labor alongside men, for example, in the fields, but they could birth children. That is, they could have labor of a childbirth as well. And so they were valued not only for their physical strength and ability as laborers, but also as child bearers who could substantially fortify the investment of slave owners. Now, this meant, of course, completely dehumanizing African women into nothing but, sort of their productive capacity. This image here was drawn or sketched in a 1634 travel account called A Relation of Some Years' Travel into Africa and the Greater Asia by an Englishman, Thomas Herbert. Herbert had sailed around the southern tip of Africa on his way to Asia and included eventually in his travel account illustrations, for example, of African women. This woman here nursing her child who clings like an insect to her back, flinging her breast over her shoulder in a kind of cartoonish sketch whereby this woman is rendered rather animalistic, primitive. All the sort of themes that will become part and parcel of an emerging racial viewpoint among Europeans that in some sense was meant to justify this trade. In other words, maybe the answer to the question is, how could such a trade be justified? Well, first you would establish the trade, and then you would set about the work of dehumanizing your subjects, and thus justifying in some sense the cruel treatment. After all, if they weren't fully human but more animalistic or primitive or subhuman, whatever, people without souls, then it somehow legitimized this treatment. And so, what we're talking about here is the beginning of a racialized thinking in the context of the African slave trade. In other words, what we would call today racism. Racism amidst a population transfer of African people now to the Western Hemisphere. I think we only have a dim appreciation, really, of what this meant, because typically when we study American history, while African people are obliquely referenced, usually as an enslaved people, not much is said beyond that. It's acknowledged that slavery existed, and perhaps even that among our founding fathers, slaveholding was common. You might have heard about things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, which were written into our Constitution. Well, we'll talk about all of this as we go on this semester, but keep in mind the footnoting of slavery in the traditional narrative of American history really says more about, I think, what's being hidden rather than what's being acknowledged. Because as it turns out, as historians have shown, African people were intrinsic to and integral to virtually every aspect of European colonial society in the Americas. Far from being a footnote, they're at the center of the narrative. You see in this illustration here a cargo ship unloading in a New World port, and among the commodities depicted are African people, that is, slaves, along with the other sort of manufactured products and imported goods. And you see them being prepped here by a slave trader who would then most likely take his coffle of slaves to the nearest market in preparation for sale. You might be interested to see, by the way, because this is sort of a non-specific New World port, this image, but you might be interested to know just where African people went. Another pie chart showing here that the greatest number of African people enslaved were taken to what we'd call the Spanish American mainland. That is, the Spanish Empire, which stretched basically from California in North America and Florida in North America to the tip of South America. The Spanish, just in sheer numbers, were the greatest importers of African people. But not far behind were the English and the Dutch. An English sugar colony like Barbados, despite its small size, was extraordinarily productive as a sugar colony, a sugar exporting colony, and perhaps tragically, the very success of Africans in cultivating that sugar crop led to their own demise, as they were often overworked and treated as objects, because the scale of sugar production in Barbados made it almost economical to simply work people to death and then replace them. But other areas too, the Dutch Caribbean, the French colonies. You notice here the British mainland North America represent, by comparison, a fairly small number. That would be included here, the 13 British colonies of North America, representing a fairly small, but to American history at least, extraordinarily significant importation of enslaved African people. Make no mistake, this is a migration that dramatically altered the population of the Western Hemisphere. Virtually everywhere you look, from North America to South America, Central America, and between the islands of the Caribbean. In fact, what you see when you start looking more closely at population statistics, that throughout the 1500s and 1600s and the 1700s, these formative centuries of development in the Western Hemisphere, from which our own nation derives its origins, that in these formative centuries, the demographic posture and positioning of African people was extraordinarily prominent. That is what we call African demographic supremacy. In many of the European plantation colonies, Africans greatly outnumbered Europeans and even native people due to their high mortality rates brought on by disease and European arrival. Outnumbered not only Europeans and native peoples, but by quite a large margin in many cases. By 1800, 60% of the migrants to the Americas crossing the Atlantic were African. So 2/3 of those who come to the Americas across the Atlantic come from Africa. In other words, a 2-to-1 disparity over Europeans. There's a simple reason for this, and we've already suggested it. It's the implantation of agriculture, cash crop export agriculture, principally sugar, but other commodities too, tobacco, rice will be just a few of the other agricultural export crops grown in the Americas. And the labor-intensive nature of them meant that the West African slave markets were the most ready supply. So African people coming here in numerically disproportionate terms as enslaved people to the Americas. Sometimes we miss this in American history because, again, we footnote it, and what we stress instead are the settler societies of New England, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and others who, coming from England, do not bring with them necessarily enslaved African people. And so we assume that, really for the most part, the story of America is the story of, settler families, coming under the rubric of liberty or freedom or something like that, to the Americas, to North America, to the English colonies, where they plant those seeds of liberty and freedom that eventually flower in the American Revolution. Well, it's a very childish perspective. In fact, it's a perspective that was essentially written for children, school children, in order to instill the proper place for European presence in the American story. But we're going to get past that. We're going to see a much fuller story, a much more inclusive story, because even though Africans are coming as enslaved people, don't forget that however dehumanizing that process was, African people were human beings. They had to live, they had to love, they had to strive under the most difficult circumstances, but not surrendering ultimately their humanity in an inhumane and cruel process. And so importantly, adding to the cultural mix that would become the Americas, including the United States of America, in some very extraordinary ways. Africans in Jamaica, as one example, first a Spanish sugar colony and then later an English sugar colony, such a large population of African people in Jamaica that through escape, through running away, the numbers of fugitive slaves grew in the mountains of Jamaica sufficient to create a brand new colony ruled entirely by African people themselves. So formidable were they that the British ultimately gave up trying to subdue this rogue colony. The French word was maroon, from the word marronage, which meant to run away. These maroon colonies, almost like little states unto themselves, ultimately the British had to send diplomats in and conduct peace negotiations and create, in effect, peace treaties. And I mention this because, the other question that always arises is, well, gee, if there were so many Africans compared to Europeans, why didn't they just rise up? And the answer is they did. In many cases, they did rise up. Jamaica is a good example. We'll have slave rebellions in the English colonies as well, and probably most famously, of course, the case of Santo Domingo, the sugar island that we know now in part as Haiti. The Haitian Revolution of the 1790s will see a slave rebellion turn into a revolution that creates a new and independent sovereign nation, Haiti, governed by formerly enslaved people. So, yes, there was resistance, there was rebellion, but ultimately the system of enslavement was so overwhelming, bolstered as it was by force, the threat of force and punishment, the alienation of African people in a new land from each other, from their overseers, that it was an extraordinarily difficult proposition to coordinate and control ultimately large-scale uprisings at great risk. And so the majority of African people experienced not that kind of large-scale rebellion, but instead lived their lives as enslaved people, defining their identities in less dramatic, but as we know now, still very influential ways. All of this leading to a repeopling, as I said before, of the Western Hemisphere. And think about that term, repeopling. The repeopling, not just the growth in population in the Americas, but a kind of exchange of population given the loss of native demographic and the arrival of African demographic. The repeopling of the Americas meant a mix of new racial and ethnic identities. One of the assignments for this week was to look at the Costa paintings of Mexico. The Costa paintings are a great sort of peek into the multiracial, multicultural, repeopled mix of the Americas. Here you see one of the Costa paintings, 18th century painting by Miguel Cabrera, showing a mixed race family with both European and Native American cultural identity. In other words, Spanish father, Indian mother. And in Mexico, as in other places, a kind of new complicated system of racial caste or casta developed, and names for the variations of mixing. So Spanish father, Indian mother, and their mestiza daughter. A mestiza was one who was born to a European and a Native American. But when you add in the African mix, as you undoubtedly have seen from the website, it became even more complicated, particularly as the generations of already mixed race people then combined together to produce even more variation, ancestral variation. No wonder that a concept like race becomes sort of crystallized, it sort of hardens. Race is not a scientific term. Science has no support of what typically we refer to as race. If you think of what you learned in your biology class about all living organisms and how we type them, beginning with kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I mean, what's missing from the list? Race. Race is a social and cultural construct. We apply it rather arbitrarily to mean sometimes color, sometimes religion, sometimes ethnic identity. But it's really something that humans create to justify or categorize, typically in power relationships and caste relationships, peoples of different ancestral mixing. So we're going to have a lot to say about race this semester and how it plays into American history. So all of this now then part and parcel of a much larger history than we usually take count of, when we talk about American history. With American history, typically it's Christopher Columbus, and then, we're off to the races, right, with the Pilgrims and the American Revolution. But as I said, it's a kind of childish version of it. It's really one created for children to assimilate, and so not being children, we're going to take a look at a more sophisticated, a more accurate, more useful, ultimately, to understanding ourselves at least, version of our history. So a new global economy built around the Atlantic world and the mixing of European, African, Native American civilizations. A new global economy built around this Atlantic world. And we say global because from the exports of the Americas to the crossroads of Europe and Asia and beyond, this Columbian exchange, as we sometimes call it, will dramatically alter the course of modern world history. The rise of new corporations, new business models, the rise of capitalism itself as we understand it, really emerging from this mix, particularly of the Atlantic slave trade. Consider for a second that some corporations which are still in business today, Lloyd's of London, for example, one of the global banking giants and insurance giants, Barclays Bank of London. Both Lloyd's and Barclays invested initially heavily in and profited from the Atlantic slave trade, and so owe their global profile to the merchandising of human beings in the colonial era. I don't think they're putting that much in their promotional efforts these days. English settlement in North America followed a similar pattern of economic investment, importation of labor, development of cash commodities. In fact, the word plantation comes from the idea of implanting or implantation of a new economy, a new labor force in the Americas. Here you see some of the corporate regalia that attended this. Make no mistake, I mean, this was a corporate endeavor, as I say, the beginnings of what we'll call global capitalism, where you have investment opportunities, joint stock, limited liability corporations, essentially financing the rise of new world colonies, the importation of labor, the development of shipping, all these things. Lloyd's of London's an insurance company, and it basically made its fortune by insuring the slave trading ships. Here you see the actual insignia of the Virginia Company, which was formed in England during the reign of King James I, chartered in 1606. It was a joint stock corporation charged with the settlement of what came to be known as the Virginia Colony. Wealthy English investors hoping to make a profit on the development of New World colonies. With a similar social and economic picture built around imported labor and cash crop agriculture. Keep in mind where there were these corporate ventures, then you not far behind you would find the human commodities, the factors of labor requiring the importation, as we've said, of large-scale enslaved migration, large-scale importing of large-scale slave peoples in a migration that we know as the Atlantic slave trade. This is actually one of again, the English insignia, which, you think about corporate labeling, corporate advertising, not even bothering to hide the fact that this particular corporate venture was essentially involved in the business of slave trading and the use of slave labor, in this case, to grow tobacco. This, in fact, was an advertisement for Virginia tobacco in the 17th century. So the successful integration of the Atlantic world into larger global movement of peoples and economies will, as I say before, introduce a completely new chapter in world history. Just a part of that chapter will be the rise of the English colonies of North America and those that come to form the United States of America. So taking this global view, this bird's eye view, this world history view, I think we have a much better appreciation for where all of this was coming from. Despite our childish stories of, religious refugees seeking freedom in the New World, this is hardly nothing to do with religion, at least religious freedom. Where the English colonies are concerned, it has much more to do with global capitalism, the large-scale migration of enslaved laboring people, and the expectation of profit. Now, within that larger matrix, of course, we will find settler folk. We will find religious dissenters, and we'll be sure to plug them in to this larger model of the Atlantic world. But I think this is our fundamental paradigm. This is our framework now for understanding where it is the United States of America is going to come. All right, so that is the end now of our Rise of an Atlantic World lecture. Next week we'll carry forward to the colonies of North America, the English colonies of North America.